blood is the life. For the record, I do have a day job and I'm working very hard to keep it. And yeah, I thought that I was done with these comparison videos, but one of my fans requested that I compare two different versions of Dracula, and I'm loyal to what few fans I have, so here we are. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Horror of Dracula and comparing it to Bram Stoker's Dracula. And real quick, I'd like to touch on the Universal version of Dracula, the classic that everyone is familiar with. I know that it is, in fact, a classic and that a lot of people love that movie with a passion, but personally, I'm not really a huge fan of it. And I've mentioned before in my Phantom of the Opera comparison that I don't care for most of Universal's old monster movies, and it's just a matter of personal taste. I'll admit that Bela Lugosi's performance is very memorable, and the guy who played Renfield was awesome, but outside of that, it's just not a very memorable, scary, or even much of an entertaining film for me. It's just not my cup of tea, but hey, if you enjoy it, awesome. But anyway, as I was saying, tonight I'm going to be talking about two versions of Dracula that I personally like. So to start off with, let's talk about some of the female characters in each of these versions. First of all, Dracula's brides. Although in Horror of Dracula, he's only got one bride. And whereas in most iterations of Dracula, the brides are these more evil, predatory characters, in this version, she's a little more tragic and sympathetic. Like when Jonathan Harker meets her for the first time at the beginning of the film, she actually approaches him and begs him to help her, and you know she's not just trying to manipulate him; she really means this. But once they get close enough to each other, this is when her instincts kick in, and she does try to attack him. In the Coppola film, on the other hand, Dracula has three brides as he's supposed to, and in this version they are much more predatory. They do attack Jonathan and torture him, and they're also much more sexualized in this version, which I don't mind in the slightest. Next up, you've got Lucy Westenra, I think is the right inflection for it. Um, Although in Horror of Dracula, her name is Lucy Homewood because she's already married to one of her suitors, Arthur. And in that version, she is a very simply written character, but she is very likable, and she is, attempting to be helpful in the mission to stop Dracula, so really nothing wrong with her. In the Coppola film, she's not yet married and she's got three different suitors that she's looking at, and is clearly having a lot of fun flirting with all three of them equally. She's much more of a free spirit in this film, is much more devious, and while some people might not find her entirely likable, I do find this version to be a little more interesting. Also, for anyone who's wondering, I have read the book, but I'm not going to be talking about which variation of a character is truer to the version that's in the book, since this is in fact a film comparison. Just wanted to make that clear. Next, you've got Mina Harker, the bride of the main character, Jonathan. In the original film, you don't see much of Mina, as she was when she was alive. You only see her after she's been transformed by Dracula, and the actress who plays her does give a very creepy performance. Now, in the Coppola film, I've heard a lot of people complain about Winona Ryder's performance as Mina Harker, and honestly, I think she does fine. I just don't care for the way that the character is portrayed in this version. In this case, you can tell which version I'm leaning more towards, but yeah, I'm not really a fan of the love story that they shove into the movie between her and Dracula. The fact that she's supposed to be the reincarnation of his dead lover, it it's not necessary. Next up, Arthur Homewood. In the original, this character is played by Michael Go, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names. Um, but for those of you who don't know, he's the actor who played Alfred in the Tim Burton, Joel Schumacher Batman films. And, in that version, he just starts off as sort of an angry character. He's not very happy with the way things that are going, and he's actually blaming Van Helsing for some of these deaths that are occurring. But, once he finds out what's going on, he warms up very quickly and becomes a more likable and heroic character. And in the Coppola film, he pretty much just goes through the same character arc. The key difference is that when you're first introduced to him, he just comes off as more of a snob. Moving on. And now on to Jonathan Harker. Now, in talking about this character, I'm going to be giving away some mild spoilers about Horror of Dracula. Now, for those of you who know the basic storyline for Dracula but have not seen this movie, I would suggest checking out Horror of Dracula first so that you can be surprised by where the story goes, as I was, and maybe come back to this video later. So, in that movie, it starts off in the same way as the classic Dracula story, where Jonathan is going to Dracula's castle, only instead of selling him a house, he's supposed to be working as Dracula's bookkeeper, I believe. Only in this, he also has a secret mission in mind. He and Van Helsing are working together to stop this monster, and he's kind of infiltrating the castle with that purpose. In the Coppola film, Jonathan goes to Dracula's castle to sell him a house in London and ends up being held hostage there by Dracula's brides before he eventually returns home and joins in the fight to, destroy Dracula. And in this version, he is played by Keanu Reeves, one of the biggest casting mistakes in movie history. Whereas I didn't mind Winona Ryder at all, Keanu Reeves' acting in this was very noticeably poor. I mean, I don't know why Coppola thought it would be a good idea to cast the guy from Bill and Ted in this role. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate Keanu Reeves. I mean, I think he's hilarious in Bill and Ted, and he has been in some really entertaining movies like The Matrix and Point Break, but he's really not a good fit for Jonathan Harker. The English accent and the acting is just atrocious. I mean, I admire him for trying to take on this more serious, dramatic role, but he probably should have at least waited a few more years and kind of honed his acting skills a little more before he did so. Now on to Van Helsing, who is very noticeably different in each iteration. Um, in Horror of Dracula, the character is played by Peter Cushing, and he's very badass. He's a very strong-willed, heroic character. You believe that this guy could go toe-to-toe with Dracula and win. But at the same time, he is also very likable. He's a perfect gentleman, and he's got a lot of warmth to him. I mean, he's practically the perfect hero for the movie. In the Coppola film, Van Helsing is played by Anthony Hopkins, who does an excellent job at playing this fucking lunatic. He is not a likable character at all. He has no emotion, no warmth. When he talks about killing one of these women who has been turned into a vampire, it is just in the most indifferent and heartless way possible. He has a dinner conversation about the method of killing a vampire as if it is the type of thing to talk about when people are eating. But he is very memorable. And you can believe that the characters, of course, are keeping him by their side because he does, in fact, know what he's doing when it comes to vampire killing. And now, before we wrap this thing up, let's talk about the Prince of Blood himself, Dracula. In Horror of Dracula, the character is played by Christopher Lee, the late great actor who is known for playing Dracula in several movies, and awesomely so. In Horror of Dracula, the character isn't given a whole lot of screen time, and I think throughout the entire movie he only has one line of dialogue, but honestly, he doesn't really need to say that much. He's Dracula. You know, whenever you do see him on screen, you do believe that this is a powerful and intelligent creature. He is very menacing and creepy, and towards the final act, when things are starting to go downhill for him and he's fighting his final battle, the look of pure rage in his face is just terrifying. I mean, if I saw this dapper gentleman suddenly, with his eyes turning red and his teeth bared with his fangs out, I'd be getting the fuck out of Dodge. In the Coppola film, Dracula is played by Gary Oldman, and by the way, I just now realized what a coincidence it is that I'm wearing him on my shirt. This wasn't even planned out at all. But yeah, he is another great actor, and in the film he plays the part really well. I love it when he's introduced as this centuries old creature who has gone half mad with age. He just chews up the scenery every time he's on screen, and he is pretty terrifying at times, but he's also much more sympathetic in this film. While I don't like the forced romance between him and Mina Harker, there are some scenes where I truly felt sorry for the character, which, speaks volumes about Gary Oldman's performance. I mean, I don't like that part of the story, but it still affects me on an emotional level. And he is still fairly scary in some parts throughout the film, like when you see him underground and his face is kind of coming out of the dirt with blood dripping from his mouth. There's one part where you see that face screaming in rage. It's some pretty dark imagery for sure. There are some pretty weird moments, though, that I didn't care for with the character. Like, at one point, Dracula turns into a wolf and kind of teleports into this garden where he has sex with Lucy. The film could have definitely done without that. Also, when he is in his old man form at the beginning, there's a point where you see that the palms of his hands are covered in this thick hair. Uh, has he been playing with himself too much? So, in the end, I do think that each film has something of its own to bring to the table. In the case of the Coppola film, this is something I didn't bring up in comparison because there's nothing to compare with the Hammer version, but the main thing I love about the 1992 version is just its style. It's really the type of movie that I could just watch on mute while playing classical music because it's just beautiful to look at. I mean, some people could argue that it's style over substance, but the style is so good that I just don't care. I mean, there are visuals in the movie that don't make any sense. They're just physically impossible. Like, there's a point where Dracula stabs this cross and it just starts gushing blood everywhere. There's a part where someone who's been transformed into a vampire gets decapitated as she's laying down, and then suddenly her head just goes spinning through the air. It makes. I mean, those of you who haven't seen the film probably think this sounds very silly, but again, it's just so cool to look at that I don't care how much sense it doesn't make. I just love the way that the film looks. However, I will have to admit that Horror of Dracula is technically a superior film. For one thing, Peter Cushing was quite obviously a better actor than Keanu Reeves. Um, Even though I was able to feel sorry for Gary Oldman as Dracula, at least Christopher Lee as the character was more consistently terrifying and wasn't having weird furry sex with Lucy or growing fur on his palms. He was able to keep from touching himself too much over the centuries. But yeah, it's just an overall better movie for the acting and the consistency of the characters. I would recommend both versions if you haven't seen them yet, but definitely check out Horror of Dracula first. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about this comparison. I hope y'all have a good one.